A great advertisement once said, "It's not how he starts, it's how he finishes." Let's finish strong with a memorable conclusion.
Everything you need to easily pass English ATAR. English ATAR made simple. Powered by Saints Coaching.
Welcome to the third and final part in this module about how to write your response to a responding section question. The first part was about introductions, the second part was about body paragraphs, and obviously this part is all about conclusions. Before the lesson on introductions, we discussed the structure of an essay, the structure of a responding section question. Make sure you have watched and completed all the activities related to those lessons before continuing with this one. If you're still here, well done. You've completed the other lessons, the other activities. Now it's time to finish strong with a great conclusion. And we do that with tick-tock before gram. It's a fundamental truth of our existence, and it's an acronym for the element of a conclusion that we looked at in the lesson on structure a few lessons ago. This lesson is going to show you what those elements look like in actual conclusions. Here's how this lesson's going to go. Firstly, we will recap the structure of a conclusion, which, as we know by this stage, is the bottom funnel of the double-ended funnel essay structure. From there, we'll analyze example 1, then analyze example 2, analyze example 3, underscore the golden rule of conclusions, very important, and then we'll outline a simple summary, wrap it up. The structure of a conclusion, let's do a quick recap of these elements. It's been a few lessons. Let's make sure we're on the same page. This is the bottom funnel, aka the conclusion. As we saw in the lesson on structure, the bottom funnel, the conclusion, is identical to the structure of the top funnel, the introduction, but flipped upside down. Identical might be a bit misleading because this bottom funnel comprises 4 elements, and the top funnel, the introduction, comprises 6 elements. We'll address why those 2 elements are omitted in the conclusion shortly. Before we do that, why is this funnel upside down? It's upside down because it's meant to achieve the inverse of what the top funnel or the introduction is meant to achieve. Remember, the introduction is meant to ease the reader into the body of your text. Imagine writing an essay without an introduction. That would be like going up to a stranger in the street and the first thing you say to them is, "Will you go out with me?" Like the introduction eases the reader into the body of your text, the conclusion eases your reader out of the text. Writing an essay without a conclusion is like going on a date with someone and then mid-meal, you all of a sudden just get up alone and leave without saying a single word to your date. You might not want to be on the date, but that doesn't mean you can just disregard social etiquette. You should always aim to write a conclusion so you can leave a lasting impression on your marker / your date. And yes, I did just refer to your date and the person marking your WACE exam as the same person. Anyway, the point I want to drive home is that if you just got up and left mid-date, yes, you could say you went on a date, but you couldn't say it was a very good one. The same thing applies to not writing a conclusion for your essay. With that stuff out of the way, let's recap the elements of our conclusion. The first one is your thesis. This first element requires you to restate the thesis that you wrote in your introduction, but with different syntax or sentence structure and different words. The next element is the terminology element. If you defined any ambiguous elements of the question in your introduction, revisit those elements here in your conclusion. Remember, ambiguous just means open to interpretation. The next element is the body paragraphs element. This part requires you to write 1 to 2 sentences that summarize the main point of each body paragraph and indicate the relevance of those main points to your thesis. Last but not least, we have the general statement. This is a statement that refers to at least one main element of the question. It also exaggerates the significance of the overarching topic that you've discussed in your essay. We can think of the general statement element as a so what statement. As I flagged a moment ago, this bottom funnel only contains 4 of the 6 elements that the top funnel contains. As we can see on the slide, the transition to text and plot synopsis elements of the introduction are omitted in the conclusion. These 2 elements aren't included in the conclusion because they're descriptive, not analytical. In essence, what this means is that these 2 elements do very little to actually answer the question. They're mere formalities of an introduction, so just get them out of the way and don't bother repeating them in your conclusion. Similar to the elements of an introduction, you might find it useful to memorize the elements of a conclusion. As I said a few minutes ago, this is our mnemonic that you can use to help you memorize each element. Tick, tock, before, gram. That's our recap of the bottom funnel, the conclusion of an essay. Now let's check out example 1. This is the same example 1 that we looked at in the lesson on planning and in the lesson on introductions 2 lessons ago. If you can't remember what the question is that this example relates to, here it is. What a weirdo. Discuss how you developed a more considered interpretation of a text by reflecting on at least one different reading of it. You'll recall that the text this question relates to is Pretty Woman, starring Julia Roberts and Richard Gere. Here is a very brief recap of steps 5 and 6 of the planning steps that we completed together in the lesson on planning. Here is step 5, which is complete the diagram. Pause the video now and have a quick skim of this diagram. And here is step 6, determine structure. You know the drill. The entirety of this step is replicated in the PDF study notes. I'll just refer to a bit of a condensed version now. My thesis for this question is I developed a more considered interpretation of Pretty Woman by reflecting on a feminist reading of it. Body paragraph 1 of this essay focused on context, body paragraph 2 focused on generic conventions, and body paragraph 3 focused on characterization, specifically visual language features. By the way, the reason why we do a recap of the planning steps is for you to see how the information that we create in our plan then appears in our actual answer. Similarly, we're doing a quick recap of each question's introduction so you can draw parallels between the info that's mentioned in the introduction and the info that's mentioned in the conclusion. Remember, a conclusion ultimately says the same thing as an introduction, but with just different words. So pay attention to those parallels between the introduction and conclusion. Here is the original version of the introduction for this question. Pause the video and have a quick read. That is our recap stuff done for this question. Now let's get into what we came here for. Here is the conclusion for this question. This is the original version. Here is the deconstructed version. Here's the thesis. I developed a more considered interpretation of PW by reflecting on a feminist reading of it. Here's the terminology section. Initially, I interpreted the text as a tale of female empowerment and emancipation. A tale that may have inspired young women in the 90s to unabashedly strive for their own goals without regard to social norms and expectations. Here's a continuation of the thesis. While this interpretation certainly has merit, contemplating a feminist reading of PW encouraged me to reconsider it. By viewing the text through a different lens, I arrived at a refined interpretation. PW implies that impecunious women need men of immense wealth to enable their own personal transformations. Here's the body paragraphs element. A feminist reading of PW challenged me to reflect on the influence of several factors, such as the differences between the cultural context of production in 1990 and the cultural context of reception in 2022, the text's propagation of the damsel in distress convention in romantic comedies, and the technical codes the film employs to recurrently objectify Vivian. Finally, we have the general statement. This overarching process of considering an alternate reading of a text has inspired me to further interrogate the impact of my preconceptions, assumptions, and biases in everyday life. That's the conclusion. Here are some comments. Let's discuss the thesis first. This thesis is a succinct restatement of the thesis that we saw in the introduction. Here's a comparison between the two. This top one is the thesis that I wrote in the introduction, and this bottom one is the thesis in the conclusion. Notice how in both versions I've still referred to key parts of the question in the exact same way they're worded in the question. My more considered interpretation, a more considered interpretation. Turning to the terminology element. In short, this section reiterates what my initial interpretation of the text was without repeating it verbatim. Verbatim just means word for word. Here is the terminology element from the intro, and this is the terminology element from the conclusion. Notice how I'm using similar words in certain parts of each sentence so the marker can identify I'm referring to the same thing, but I'm not using the exact same words in the exact same way in both versions. This is telling the marker that I understand what to do in a conclusion, which is to summarize the contents of everything that comes before it, but using different words. Instead of repeating the phrase, my initial interpretation, I say, initially, I interpreted. Instead of saying journey of self-empowerment, I say a tale of female empowerment. That's what we're going for in this section of the conclusion. Returning to the thesis element of this conclusion. You would have noticed as I was reading out the deconstructed version that the thesis element is split up into two parts. One part comes before the terminology section and the other part comes after the terminology section. I did this unintentionally as I was writing the conclusion and decided not to alter it because the writing just flowed better this way. This raises a very important point about structure in general. It's great if you can follow it, but it is okay if you have deviated from it a little bit and your writing still makes sense. So in this second part of the thesis, I address the different reading part of the question and I address the more considered interpretation part of the question. Notice how instead of repeating the words more considered, I just use the word refined instead. From there, we've got the body paragraph. Notice the difference in this part of the conclusion versus the same part in the introduction. Here's the body paragraph's element of the introduction. I'm essentially saying the same thing in both. However, in the intro, I'm just giving the marker a hint of what's to come in the body paragraph. And in the conclusion, I've given the marker a slightly more detailed summary of what I said in my body paragraphs, because at this stage, the marker has already read that stuff. Finally, we have the general statement. Compare this general statement of the conclusion with this general statement of the introduction. Notice how the general statement in the conclusion is more of a so what statement than the general statement in the introduction. The conclusion's general statement explains the broader effect that thinking about the question had on me. That is everything I wanted to say about this conclusion, which means this will be the last time we take a look at this question and this text. So we can say goodbye to Pretty Woman. See you, pretty woman. Let's move on to example number 2. This is one that we are intimately familiar with by now. The question is explain how at least one text has transformed or adapted genre to alter an audience's attitude towards an issue or concept. Our relevant text is obviously Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And here is a quick recap of the planning steps, starting with step number 5, complete the diagram. This is our diagram. Pause the video now and have a skim of this information from our plan. Moving on to our final step, step number 6. Our thesis for this question is as follows. Everything, Everywhere, All at Once has transformed the science fiction genre through its absurdist style, emotional intensity, and manipulation of structural elements to change sci-fi enthusiasts' disapproving attitudes towards absurdism. As this thesis alludes to, body paragraph 1 will focus on the movie's absurdist style, body paragraph 2 will focus on the emotional intensity, and body paragraph 3 will focus on the movie's use of structural elements. Here is the original version of the introduction that we looked at 2 lessons ago. Pause the video now so you can see how the elements of the introduction then manifest in our conclusion that we're about to take a look at. And speaking of the conclusion, here is the original version of it. Here's what it looks like deconstructed. Starting with the thesis. Everything, Everywhere transformed the science fiction genre by incorporating elements from other genres so as to alter sci-fi enthusiasts' attitude towards the concept of absurdism. In almost any other context, the assertion that humanity's existence is purposeless in the grand scheme of the universe would seem utterly depressing. An audience exposed to that information is unlikely to be receptive to it because it denies the value of all that we hold dear. Notwithstanding this, Everything, Everywhere manages to leave its audience of sci-fi enthusiasts feeling a sense of uplifting curiosity towards absurdism. Moving on to the body paragraphs. Myriad aspects of the film worked to achieve this effect. Primary among those include Daniel's absurdist directorial style, as evidenced by the antagonist's eccentric outfits, the emotional intensity of conflict between main characters like Evelyn and Jobu, and the manipulation of structural devices such as a framed narrative. Lastly, we have the general statement. Daniel's superb execution of these aspects altered their audience's attitude towards absurdism by begging the question, if our existence lacks cosmic significance, isn't that the perfect excuse to lighten up and enjoy the little things? That's the conclusion for example number 2. Now let's take a look at some comments. Firstly, let's discuss the thesis. Like my thesis in the previous example, I've decided to explain it in separate sentences rather than try and cram all of it into just one sentence. As we can see, the thesis element of the introduction is just one sentence, whereas the thesis element of the conclusion is 4 sentences. The first sentence states my overarching position on the question, which is that Everything Everywhere transformed the sci-fi genre by incorporating elements from other genres in order to alter sci-fi enthusiast attitude towards the concept of absurdism. If I had to pick one sentence from these 4 on the slide that best represents my thesis statement, it would be this first one. Remember that to alter something implies that something is going from one thing, an original state, to another thing, a changed state. This part of my thesis alludes to what the audience's original attitude towards absurdism was. By me saying the audience was unlikely to be receptive to absurdism, I'm essentially saying the audience would have had a disapproving attitude towards absurdism. That is their original attitude. I then explain why the audience would have that original attitude, a disapproving attitude, because absurdism, or at least one interpretation of it, denies the value of all that we hold dear. Finally, this thesis explains that despite the upsetting nature of absurdism, Everything Everywhere still manages to alter the audience's attitude towards it by making them have a feeling of uplifted curiosity. Next up, we have the terminology. I determined that restating the definition of absurdism in the conclusion wasn't necessary. Compare this being not restating the definition of absurdism, to how I reiterated my original interpretation of Pretty Woman in the conclusion of that response. I determined it was more important to reiterate that original interpretation because the question literally had the terms more considered interpretation, so reiterating my original interpretation was more relevant to the thesis and therefore warranted being repeated. Remember, having a terminology section in the introduction doesn't necessitate having one in the conclusion. Also, the following sentence from my thesis indirectly defines absurdism. Humanity's existence is purposeless in the grand scheme of the universe. Next, we have the body paragraphs. Note the different levels of detail between my body paragraphs element in the conclusion versus the body paragraphs element in the introduction. The conclusion's body paragraphs element provides a little bit more detail about what I said in each body paragraph than the equivalent element in the introduction. Remember, I'm doing this because in the body paragraphs element of the introduction, I'm just teasing the marker for what's to come, but then in the conclusion, the marker's already read the essay, so I don't need to tease anything. I'll just do a very brief summary of what I mentioned. Finally, we've got the general statement. Once again, this general statement is more thought-provoking than the equivalent general statement in the introduction. The introduction's general statement is just a general statement about genre, whereas the conclusion's general statement ends by asking the reader or the marker a question. It's intended to get the marker thinking, and ultimately it's intended to get the marker to remember your response among all the others that they're reading. And that is example number 2, done and dusted. Let's turn to our third and final example. This is the question for example number 3. We have compare how 2 texts of different modes use textual features to represent a similar idea or theme. This comes from the 2018 WACE exam. Not again. Quick recap of the last 2 planning steps. Step number 5 is the second last one. This is half of the completed diagram that we did, and this is the other half of the completed diagram. Pause the video and have a quick read of both halves, and then we'll take a look at step number 6 together. Step number 6, determine structure. This is the thesis that we planned for in the planning lesson. Snow Crash and Arrival use textual features to represent similar themes pertaining to language. Body paragraph 1 discussed a difference between the texts, namely how Snow Crash uses analogies and then how Arrival uses the narration of Louise Banks, who is the protagonist. Body paragraph 2 then turns to a similarity between the texts, and this similarity is how Snow Crash and Arrival use symbolism. The third third and final body paragraph discusses a difference and focuses on the setting of the metaverse in Snow Crash and the use of a circular structure in Arrival. That's a recap of our planning steps. Here is a recap of the original version of the introduction that we looked at in the introduction lesson. Pause the video, have a read of the introduction so you can draw parallels between the information here and the information that we're about to see in the conclusion. And here is the original version of the conclusion. Let's check out the deconstructed version. Here is the thesis. SC and Arrival utilize the textual features of their respective modes to represent a similar theme about language. Created in the written mode, SC underscores the ubiquity of encoded information, whereas Arrival and its multimodality emphasizes the impact of language on cognition. Turning to the body paragraphs element. Both texts similarly employ symbolism to represent their respective themes. Stevenson's command of figurative language constructs bodily fluids as biological vectors for transmitting information, while Villeneuve's incorporation of binary shapes, i.e. squares versus circles, juxtaposes human and alien perceptions of time. The divergence in the text's use of textual features is exhibited through Stevenson's use of analogies to explain various information systems and his construction of the metaverse as exemplifying the power of language, i.e. computer code, to alter reality. Villeneuve's Arrival, on the other hand, heavily relies on the protagonist's narration and the narrative's circular structure. Last but not least, our general statement. Ultimately, the effectiveness of both texts in representing a similar theme about language is a testament to the broader role of modality as a vehicle to convey meaning. That is our final conclusion. Let's discuss some comments in relation to it one last time. Starting with the thesis. As we can see, the thesis element in my conclusion is lengthier than the equivalent element in the introduction. The thesis element in the conclusion is lengthier because it states what the similar overarching theme is, and then it states what individual theme each text represents. Now the Nope. Don't write a terminology section in the conclusion if you didn't write one in the intro. A terminology section wasn't necessary in the intro because there weren't any ambiguous terms in the question. This question's difficulty lies in its requirement for us to compare two texts. Now let's discuss the body paragraphs element. Like the other two examples, this body paragraphs element in this conclusion is lengthier than the body paragraphs element in the introduction. This isn't a strict requirement, but rather it's a stylistic choice that I like to make to differentiate the conclusion from the introduction. Notice how I provide a bit more information about each body paragraph in this version compared to this version. The first body paragraph is about symbolism. In this version, I refer to symbolism here and here. Then in this version, I refer to it a lot more. The second body paragraph is about analogies. In this version, I just mentioned the word analogies. In this version, I provide a little bit more detail. Finally, the third body paragraph is about the setting. Here, I just use the word setting, and here I explain it a little bit more. I didn't provide more info here or here, but you get the point. The intro teases at what's to come. The conclusion concisely summarizes what you've already said. Note, in the introduction, I stated the themes in the body paragraph section, but in the conclusion, I referred to the themes in the thesis section. There is not a clear-cut line between what information belongs in each section. Just try to follow these guidelines as best you can and you will be on the right track. Finally, we have the general statement. The general statement in the introduction says that mode plays a big role in representing themes, whereas the general statement in the conclusion says that mode plays a big role in impacting the overall meaning of a text. In the conclusions version of the general statement, I exaggerate the importance of the question more so than I do in the introductions version. That's it for example number 3. One more main section to the lesson before we turn to a simple summary. That section is the golden rule of conclusions. I'm just going to get straight to the point here and say it. Don't include any information in the conclusion that you have not already referred to in your response. Breaking this rule is a big no-no. But why. In short, the objective of a conclusion is to summarize the information you've already discussed, not introduce new information. Why shouldn't you introduce new information? Basically, it's confusing. Here's an example to illustrate why it's confusing. Imagine you're watching the final act of Spider-Man No Way Home. All the Spider-Mans have teamed up against the Green Goblin and Electro, and then all of a sudden, Thanos appears. Then the movie ends without explaining anything about Thanos. So instead of leaving the movie thinking about how good the story was, you'd likely leave thinking that Thanos' unexplained appearance raised more questions than it answered, and ultimately it detracted from the storyline. It's the same thing when it comes to including new information in the conclusion of your essay. It's confusing and it detracts from your thesis. So please don't do it. You can avoid including new information in your conclusion by following the structure of a conclusion, i.e. the bottom funnel that you've learned in this module. In other words, there's no room in the TikTok before Graham conclusion structure for any new information. So following that structure means that you will adhere to this golden rule of not introducing new information in the conclusion. And we're done for this lesson. Here is a simple summary. First part of this lesson, we recap the structure of a conclusion, aka the bottom funnel. Our mnemonic for this part of an essay, the conclusion, is TikTok before Graham. This mnemonic stands for, firstly, thesis. The thesis restates your thesis in the introduction with different words and syntax. The next letter stands for terminology, and this revisits any ambiguous elements of the question that you defined in the introduction. The next element is the body paragraphs element. This is 1 to 2 sentences that summarize the main point of each body paragraph and then indicate the relevance of those main points to your thesis. The final element is the general statement. This is a statement that refers to at least one main element of the question and then exaggerates the significance of the overarching topic you've discussed. After we recap the structure of a conclusion, we then looked at examples 1, 2, and 3. Here are some key takeaways in relation to our discussion of all of these examples. Firstly, you don't need to sequence each element of a conclusion, i.e. TikTok before Graham, in the prescribed order. For example, you might write the body paragraph section before the thesis section. However, you should always have the general statement last. That's a big one. Also, there isn't a clear-cut line between what information belongs in which section. Those are some general comments about the conclusion. Here are some specific comments about each element of it. Regarding the thesis, you don't need to complete the thesis section of your conclusion before moving to the next element. For example, in example 1, my conclusion starts with one thesis sentence, proceeds to one terminology sentence, and then returns to 2 more thesis sentences. Another key takeaway regarding the thesis, you can write several concise sentences in the thesis section of your conclusion, as opposed to one lengthier sentence for the thesis in your introduction. Turning to the terminology section of the conclusion. A terminology section in the introduction doesn't necessitate having one in the conclusion. Another one, don't write a terminology section in the conclusion if you didn't write one in the introduction. This is alluding to the golden rule of conclusions. Also, if you incorporate a terminology section in the conclusion, ensure your definition of the term is worded differently so it doesn't sound the same as your definition in the introduction. Then we've got the body paragraphs. Importantly, providing slightly more detail in the body paragraph section of the conclusion compared to the equivalent section of the intro is a good way to make both paragraphs sound different while still getting the same essential message across. This approach also hints at what you're going to say in the intro without giving away any spoilers. For example, in the intro, I might say the relevance of context, generic conventions, and technical construction. And then in the conclusion, I might say, a feminist reading of PW challenged me to reflect on the influence of several factors, such as my situational context of being a privileged white male, the text propagation of the damsel in distress convention in romantic comedies, and the technical codes the film employs to recurrently objectify Vivian. Notice how the conclusion expands on each element mentioned in the introduction. Finally, we've got some points about the general statement. The general statement in the conclusion is more thought-provoking than the general statement in the introduction. In other words, the conclusion's general statement is more of a so what statement. It exaggerates the question's significance. For example, I might say in the intro, it is not uncommon for an audience to refine their interpretation of a text after reflecting on one different to their own. My conclusion could then be, this overarching process of considering an alternate reading of a text has inspired me to further interrogate the impact of my preconceptions, assumptions, and biases in everyday life. Finally, the primary purpose of a thought-provoking general statement in the conclusion is to leave a lasting impact on the marker so your response stands out among the rest. The final main section of this lesson discussed the golden rule of conclusions. The golden rule is don't include any information in the conclusion that you haven't already referred to in your response. That concludes our exploration of what an essay looks like.
Yeah.
The PDF activities for this lesson follow a very similar structure to the activities for the last few, so they should be pretty straightforward. Good luck with smashing out those conclusions and finishing off each response. Close that loop. I'll see you in the next one, which is a review lesson, and it is the last video lesson for this module. Until then, keep it simple.